what I'm going to speak about is privatization, and some people would say this is not a philosophical subject. And the reason they would say it's not a philosophical subject is because the traditional way in which the discussion about privatization is going is basically there is a job to be done. To build, to guarantee police, to guarantee prisons, and then we look for the best agent to do it. And we look at the world and we see, oh, private organization, public organization, and then the issue of whether to privatize something or whether not to privatize something is basically a matter of instrumental considerations that are primarily the subject matter of social science. Yeah? The social scientists can tell us, theoretically, I don't believe they can, but let's say. It can tell us whether prisons could be run better by governments or by private entities. This is the way the traditional understanding of the issue of privatization has been going. It's been more sophisticated and more subtle. People speak about accountability and so on and so on. But this is basically the terms of the debate. This article, this is an article and will be also a chapter in a book I'm trying in vain to write. This article challenges the terms of the debate and defends basically two claims. First, some governmental decisions cannot be successfully executed by private entities, as the goods resulting from this decision are inherently public goods. They can be realized only if the state performs these tasks. And second, execution by the state requires performance by public officials. The conjunction of these two claims implies that some decision must be executed by public officials. So this is the main terms of, this is the main argument. I want only to say something about the motivation. The argument seeks to strike an intuitive chord, which instrumental arguments for and against privatization necessarily fails to explain. And the intuitive chord is that many people oppose mercenaries, private prisons, private police, and they do it for many reasons. And there is a wonderful book by Sarah Percy on the history of mercenaries showing that there was opposition to mercenaries, private soldiers, for generation and generation since the 12th century, and yet the arguments change all the time, and the arguments seem to me like rationalizations of something deeper that is going on there. Okay. We argue, I mean, this is a joint paper with Avichai Dorfman, I forgot to say, at the University of Tel Aviv Law Faculty. We start by this paper by distinguishing between two ways in which somebody can help the sovereign. There is a sovereign, we can call him Rex or her Regina, and we call him Rex. And there are two ways in which a system can help. One, we label it fidelity by reason, and the other is fidelity by deference. When an assistant or an official uses fidelity of reason, they actually look at what the best way to perform the task that was commanded by the sovereign in accordance with the public interest. So if I am a prison warden and I was ordered to lock up David, I ask whether to discipline him because he has conducted something bad in the prison. I ask what the public interest requires. Should I put him in solitary confinement? Does this serve the public interest or not? According to my view. The second form of assistant is what we label differential. And differential means that I look at this point, I'll change later on the definition of differential, but at this point, differential means that I look at the way the sovereign thinks about it. I defer my judgment to the sovereign. And I ask, what would the sovereign say under these circumstances? Now, what we argue is that if the act of locking up is done in the name of the state, it ought to be differential rather than ought to be based on fidelity by reason. It ought to reflect the sovereign, it ought in some ways to touch upon or to emanate from the sovereign. But here we come to the serious problem. I mean, obviously, the prison warden has no access to the sovereign. And obviously the sovereign would never have thought about what David has done in the prison and the proper reaction to this. There is nothing in the world that can connect the act of the prison warden to the sovereign. In order to solve this problem, we develop what we call integrative practices, or the concept of integrative practices. The obvious challenge is that differential conception of fidelity is impractical. In reality, the execution of any task leaves ample room for discretion. The agent responsible for it can do a lot of things to decide it. And then how can we connect me putting David in solitary confinement to the sovereign? Okay. So if there is no actual will of a sovereign in our real world and no actual will of anything, how do we solve it? We argue that there are two conditions that must be satisfied in order for persons successfully to act in the name of the state. The existence of a practice is one, and its institutional form. You protest? Thus, speaking and acting in the name of the state requires a practice which takes a distinctive form, namely one which integrates the political and bureaucratic in the execution of the relevant functions. Okay, so what are the conditions? There are two conditions. One is the existence of an effective practice. What does it mean, the existence of an effective practice? It means approaching the task depends on there being an ongoing framework or coordinative efforts in which participants immerse themselves together in formulating, articulating, shaping a shared perspective from which they can approach. In other words, when I do the stuff in less kind of figurative terms, when I do the stuff, I look at what my friend did, I look at what others did, I look at precedents, I ask my friends what is the appropriate reaction, so there is a kind of practice. If you want, it's close to the concept of social rule in heart. Yeah? To this extent, a practice can potentially place constraints on the practical deliberation of the participant. We have a practice, but the practice could be private. It need not be public. So what makes it public? Here we suggest that what makes it public is what we call an integrative form of the practice. Namely that the practice is one that, in a way, the participants in the practice are ones that are both politicians on the one hand and the bureaucrats and the officials on the other hand. Thus, what makes it a public practice is the fact that there is an integration of political offices in the community of practice. Integration enables officials, political figures, to guide within the limits of their legal powers the ongoing deliberation and everyday actions performed by bureaucrats. In that respect, public officials can exert their influence on other participants, and they are part of the operation of the prison, of the police, of whatever. In order to see what's the difference between public and private in this respect, think about the typical way in which privatization agreements are working. Yeah? Privatization agreements, what happens is that the government sets certain constraints. And then there is a contract. And under the contract, the company runs, let's say, runs a prison. I'm speaking here about prison. It could be any other public job. And the contract makes some room, what we label in this paper an arena of permissibility, as it were. The private entity can meet the designated end with whatever means, provided that they are consistent with the basic constraints. But then the decision within this constraint, within this arena of permissibility, are basically not done in the name of the state. They are done in the name of the official, in a way, because he or she makes the decision, because the government cannot interfere, because the contract creates a kind of separation wall between the particular decision and the within the contract, within the arena of permissibility, whatever. Okay. So we argue that things are done in the name of the state
when there is an integrative practice. When there is a practice that constrains what officials can do, they look at what others do, blah, 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 social rule hard. And this practice is integrative. It is a practice in which the participants that determine what the practice is and what rules, what things come out of the practice are both politicians and officials. And then we define public officials as those that participate in integrative practice. In other words, the integrative practice defines who is public official. This is what for us public official. So of course we don't. There is no full overlap with the characterization in the law. Yeah, because there are many discussions what public officials are and who are not, and so on and so on. And there is Weber and there is Schmeber and so on and so on. But we provide an analysis which I think which is a normative analysis that also defines who the public officials are. Note that nothing in this argument presupposes that politicians make actual use of their power to influence the practice. In some cases they don't. But we argue that what needs to be there is a readiness and willingness to interfere when the service is not provided in the way they want. Okay. Now, you could ask me, you should ask me, why should we care if something is done in the name of the state, or whether it should, or not? Why should we care about this? As long as we provide the good, yeah, we lock the right people up, we inflict the right sanctions on them, why should we care who does it? We argue that at least under plausible premises, we argue that there is something called that we label inherently public goods. They are goods that cannot be fully specified and realized apart from state institutions. And the two examples that we provide are criminal law, criminal sanctions, and also wars, fighting wars. Fighting wars and inflicting criminal sanctions ought to be done in the name of the state. I just bring you an example that is untied to those. This is part of what one can call agent-dependent goods, namely goods that depends on who the agent that provides them is. So let's say David wants to bring flowers to his wife, but he thinks that Amanda, what's your name? That Amanda can choose better flowers. But still it would be wrong sometimes that Amanda will bring the flowers to, or even choose the flowers. So the goods of providing the flowers in this case would be a good that depends on the agent. The other example that I use in other papers that I wrote about this issue are blood feuds. I know some of you don't like the practice. I have some sympathy towards it in some ways, for reasons that I could explain. Yeah? But the important thing about blood feuds that I found out to my great amazement when I read some anthropological stuff on this is that the only person that can do it are male relatives of the deceased, and this is quite general in many cultures. Yeah, I don't know if in all cultures, but in many cultures it's only male relatives of the deceased. Otherwise, it's not that it's a wrong blood feud. It's not a blood feud. It's just a murder. You didn't fulfill the job. You didn't do the job. We think that criminal sanctions is in a way a good that depends on who the agent is, and the reason is very simple. Of course, anybody can impose criminal sanctions. Anybody can impose criminal sanctions that deter, that inflict, that even do retributive justice, if you believe in retributive justice, namely that give people what they deserve. But there is something else in in inflicting sanctions that is unique to criminal sanction. This is a type of condemnation. It's a judgment that what you did is wrong. And in order to make a judgment that what you think you do is wrong, you need to be in some way superior to the person whose judgment you judge. Now, it could be either on epistemic grounds that you are better, or it could be on legitimacy-based ground because you are the only person that it is legitimate for him. If you take it back to parents, parents sometimes discipline their children, and there's physical discipline, and Mr. Blackstone thought that this is very desirable. Physical disciplining of children, but the only person that can do it is a parent. because the parents enjoy, in some respect, the parents, the question of who the agents that can censor your behavior is crucial here, because not anybody can censor your behavior. If I steal from Gadi and his dog bites me, we wouldn't say the dog punished me. Punishment ought to emanate, and it depends on the type of punishments and so on, ought to emanate from an agent that can. We do the same, we make some similar argument with respect to wars. Okay, so let me just end up. So conventional wisdom, the contemporary debate concerning privatization is grounded in an attempt to identify who are the agents that are more capable of performing a state function in furthering the public interest. Success and failure of conditions against which the performance is measured are in principle independent of the identity of the agent. The basic premise of the debate is that determining who is more capable of performing the function is grounded in answering the question of who is better capable of doing it. The identity of the best agent is contingent on the agent performance. We argue that that this cannot explain the intuitive resistance to privatization, and we inverse, in a way, the argument. The claim that the empirical claim made that some agents are better are mere rationalization of non-instrumental consideration. In reality, the intuitive is not resistant to privatization, is not instrumental. And just to say something quite speculative that I was thinking in recent days while I was flying all over from Singapore to Israel and basically dying on the flight from fever, I was thinking that maybe this is a reason why we need a state. We need a state so that there will be an agent who is supreme to us. So in a way, the whole argument for equality that is quite central to liberal thinking, ignore the fact that there are some jobs that can be done only when there is an entity or an agent who is superior to us, and this is the state. Now, of course, why it's a different question. I don't believe that this is, the reasons are epistemic reasons, but this is for my next paper next year. Thank you very much.
We have an extra minute for questions. Yeah.
So it looks like one presupposition of the paper is that there's a certain duality. Either you privatize an institution or you don't privatize. Either you privatize the army or either you privatize the educational system or you don't. But the reality is, you know very well, is not that. You outsource things very gradually. So at the beginning in the educational system, you outsource the cleaners, and then the people that provide the textbooks, and then the teachers, and then the test systems. And so that raises the question, at what level do you have to have a public official? I mean, is it enough that the minister is the public official? Does this count as non-privatization? Or do you have to have the cleaners be public officials as well?
No, I agree. The question is whether the cleaning is an intrinsically public good. Yeah, and here, so in a way, your normative questions as to what is intrinsically public good, namely goods that only the state can provide, will determine the question of what you can privatize. Now, of course, I don't think the cleaners are. I mean, I would like to think, because I'm a socialist, and you know, this is where I come from. I'm a painik to the Israelis here, but I believe everything ought to be done by the state. But of course, you need an argument as to why the particular job is an intrinsically public. Some people could deny this. I mean, look, all the economic analysis would deny that punishment is an intrinsically public good. Yeah? I've done a lot of work in economic analysis of criminal law, and that's a basic premise there, and this is a basic way to. So they don't think that there is a censoring involved. There is only deterrence, and then even punishment is not. So it depends on your view about the particular good.
Okay, so can you give an example? Sorry, is this?
Can I give you an example of what?
So take the educational system. Yeah. Which part is the
I don't believe
good here?
Okay, so to be frank, I didn't think about education. I mean, we didn't make any argument there. I don't think education is an intrinsically public good. I don't think it ought to be provided by the state. The state ought to guarantee that it be provided in a good way. But I don't think it's I would like to think, because this would extend my thesis to more fields. But,
well, a little bit in this direction, you're taking a view of criminal punishment, a certain view of that, and There are other views, I think, possible of criminal punishment. For example, it could be viewed as an educational process, in which case it might, if you don't accept that education is the proper role of the state, then you would have to exclude this also. And it can also be viewed, at least since Plato, as a kind of therapeutic process, parallel to a doctor. And a doctor wouldn't necessarily have to be a public institution if what we do to criminals is really cure them or educate them, and we could take out the personal element that you were seeing in it, then how would your analysis be able to deal with those alternative views of?
Well, you're right. Actually, I think education will still maintain that the state that's intrinsically public good, because education also means that the educator knows better. Yeah, it also means a kind of hierarchy there. So it's all about the hierarchy in this context. It's all about who is superior to whom.
Well, a doctor is also superior.
Yes, although with respect, yeah, you're right. But I don't think that I'm all in favor of public medicine, or they call it in the US socialized medicine, which I learned to my great amazement like 20 years ago that this is a pejorative. It took me a while, I was in a discussion and I didn't figure out what they're talking about. Suddenly I said, they regard it as a pejorative, that's strange. But I agree with you that my view about punishment will determine whether it's intrinsically public or not. And different theories. We use here a particular theory under which it is public. It's an intrinsically public good. But if you disagree with this, that's okay. Yeah.
Why think that? So I'm assuming, for the sake of argument, you need the kind of judgment expressed as a part of the punishment. Why think that any kind of supremacy is needed for that?
Well, somebody that makes a judgment about the question of whether my behavior is moral or not has to have understanding of what morality is, has to have legitimacy to do it. So I can, it depends on the context, yeah? If I condemn your behavior as a friend, I can express judgment. But of course I cannot inflict any type of institutional punishment.
But I thought the point was about the judgment. Something
no,
the judgment presupposes.
Yeah, but yes, but the type of judgment, that is necessary for criminals, the infliction of criminal sanction.
What's the content of the judgment?
What's the content of the judgment?
You
did something against the public good or something like this.
I can say that without being.
You can say this, but the question.
I can know it. I can assert it.
You can assert it, but you can't assert it authoritatively.
But now you're begging the question, right?
No, I'm not begging the question.
The question was, why can it only be done by the state? And I thought your suggestion was because it presupposes some kind of supremacy. Okay. And now, when pushed on why we need this supremacy or why the presupposition is there, you say, well, no, because what you need is an authoritative expression of this judgment.
No, you need.
But this presupposes that you need an authoritative expression of the judgment.
No.
I thought your point was to show that what you need is authority rather than human expression.
You can express. There are different contexts in which you express judgment about people's.
Sure.
If you are a teacher, your expression of judgment, the student did something wrong, is different and entitles you to do different things than if you are a friend of sitting next to the students. It's a particular type of judgment that has that comes with particular types of powers. Yeah? So you could say that the dog expressed judgment on the fact that I stole from Gadi. I don't know. Maybe the dog really. No, the dog. Well, I don't know if the dog is irrelevant. But you see, who the answer that I can give to somebody that says you acted against the public good, some particular individual, is who are you to say? No? That's something that, under certain plausible assumptions, you cannot tell the state. Yeah? You can't argue against the state. Who are you to make this judgment? This is the difference.
Wow.
I need a reminder first. In the beginning, you distinguished between the differential.
Yeah.
And what was the other term?
Reason, fidelity of reason.
Okay. So my question is somewhat tangential to your main point, which I think I have sympathy with, and maybe it depends on the success, on whether you can successfully answer David's question.
Mm.
But why are these two mutually exclusive? It would seem to me that you would have a different, what you call the differential attitude, but it would still can and should be combined with a substantive, in the sense of functional directive. That is, on the formal level, you would want it to be authorized by the state and acting for the state, in the name of the state, in the way you described. And still, since in the end, as you said, there is no such direct access to what the state wants and so on, so the actual operation would be by thinking about the proper function. Why would the state be imposing punishment? And in fact, if the state, if the official deems the state to be ordering punishment which is against the good reasons, which is immoral, then the official should maybe not do that.
Well, that's an argument that we a little bit deal in the paper, but of course there may be a divergence. There may be a divergence because under our view there are conventions that determine what can be done in the name of state or not. Yeah, there are practices. And maybe the official disagrees with the practice. No? He or she may disagree with the practice. But so there can always be a divergence between the practice, which under our view, if it's an integrative practice, is basically the will of the state, is basically reflective of the will of the state, and the private judgment of the official. In this case, the official has to defer. Now, you say he ought not to defer, and that's interesting. Of course, this is a challenge. Why ought he to defer? And that's part of what the argument is, that there is value in acting in the name of the state. Now, of course, the other challenge that we have, and I don't know if you allude to this, is, of course, that there ought to be boundaries to the deference, and we discuss this. I mean, we have an answer. I don't know if it's a satisfactory answer. If I had time, I could elaborate it.
We have less than 2 minutes. These three people, please be very short on that.
About mercenaries. First, your argument is for saving explaining the against privatization, but first, do you want to deal with the justification of this intuition?
Well, we provide the justification.
Like,
this is a justification,
okay.
yeah.
So I want to say to raise something about this intuition. If you look at privatization in the army, what about an electric fence which is maintained by a private organization? That doesn't seem a problem.
Yes, I mean, again, in order for it to be a problem, there ought to be certain decisions that are being made and that are not determined by or not in a way controlled by or determined by the sovereign, and which are part of an intrinsically public good, a good that ought to be provided by the state. Because in this case, it's the official that makes the decision rather than the state.
So isn't it the problem that if there is there are very determinate laws or norms which are sort of closed, they don't need discretion, I don't know, but wouldn't that be enough to be...
if there are what? Sorry.
If the rules or the laws or the norms which govern...
if they don't give any discretion, yeah, that's okay with
right.
us.
Yeah, the discretion is the problem.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, last question.
So I think this idea of agent-dependent goods is kind of intuitive, but the most paradigmatic examples seem to be from extremely private and personal morality, right? The gift should come from the right sort of person, and in the blood feud example, the revenge should come at the hands of a family member or something like that. But the claim that you're making is very general. It applies to the state. So you've got to be able to say at least something about what makes a good agent dependent. So this gentleman here said, look, I mean, sometimes we privatize, both of these guys in fact, we privatize certain things like cleaning duties, but you know, someone might say, look, cleanliness is close to godliness. It's you know, it's got to be done by you know, the sovereign himself. You know, so what is it? You've got to say something about this. You know, what is it that makes
I argue
agent
this,
sensitive?
I argue this about punishment. Just to give you, just to illustrate this. So I say the dog doesn't punish you when it bites you. But if you train the dog to punish thieves by biting them, then you could say that you punish them. Why? Because you formed an intention to sandal them, you did it on the basis of a moral judgment, blah, 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 blah. Yeah? So what we need is that I could actually properly say that the punishment is done by the state, because only the state can make such a judgment and act on the basis of it in certain way. Yeah? So that's and the good here is a censoring, and for this good to be provided, one must take into consideration. So we ought to look
specific to punishment.
What?
That's just specific to punishment, but I thought
I
that
agree.
theory is general.
No, it's not general. We actually look at different we examine here only two practices, namely punishment and war, but I invite you all to expand on this and explain many other practices, as many as possible in these terms. Yeah, thank you. But we do it by practice. Yeah, we don't make a general. Of course, we don't make a general claim, because there are things that we don't care will be provided. Even I believe that cleaning could be done by private.
Thank you very much.